Okay, so when we're approaching the upper limb, one of the key things that we need to consider is that the endpoint goal is always to restore that distal to proximal load distribution. So just because it's the endpoint goal doesn't mean that we want to go distally every single time, okay? Because when we look at the proximal tissues, we have to understand these global design features. We obviously have a lot more muscle mass proximally. And so if we look at that compared to the hand, for example, we have much less muscle mass as we move distally, right? With a lot more tendinous tissue. From a joint perspective, we have a lot more complexity around the midline with a smaller distance between the joint segments across the spine. And as we move distally into the humerus, we have a bony segment with not a lot of segmentation at all. So we need certain tissues to take on that role to distribute load across broad surface areas. And those are your biarticular tissues. And as we move into the ulna and radius as well, the same type of features need to be displayed. But as we move into the hand and the wrist, the joint architecture becomes a little bit more complex, and that's important because it allows us to interact with a very complex environment. So if we had a hand with a joint architecture like the humerus, where it was just a lot of long bones with not a lot of segmentation, that would be a very poor design feature through the hand to allow us to interact with a very complex environment, okay? So as we move from distal to proximal, we move from complex joint organization to more simplified joint organization to more complex joint organization. And this complex to simplified to complex distribution is what really allows for a much more adaptable coordinative structure, if you like, or an adaptable upper limb, where each portion of that limb into the midline will take on a different role to be able to handle stress. We don't want each portion of this limb doing the exact same or expressing the same exact behavior, because that's the opposite of what would allow for an adaptable structure, okay? A very, very simplified muscular feature, as well as looking at more muscle mass proximally versus distally. And obviously as we move more locally, that's when we're looking at how we can try and alter the muscular behavior of different regions throughout that upper limb. Okay, so one of the key things when we're looking at the global dissociation capacity between the upper limb and the midline as a whole, ideally what we want is the upper limb to express the capacity to interact with the environment. Okay, now if your shoulder blade, your scapula is retracted, that's going to increase the muscle activity of all the extensor tissues along the spine. And if we're retracted, that's not going to really allow me to move that limb into the environment in front of me to interact with it. So it's not actually going to, so if Connor maintains that scapula into adduction and external rotation, that's not going to create a proximal environment for that upper limb to interact with the environment. Okay, now it can help his nervous system feel safe that the upper limb is safe from forces, but it doesn't allow for adaptability. It doesn't allow for the limb to interact with the environment. So one of the key things on a muscular level that allows for that limb to dissociate from the midline is to allow for the scapula to be able to protract, abduct and internally rotate, to slide around the rib cage, to allow for that limb to reach outside of your base of support, because not only does that allow for these proximal tissues to express more eccentric behavior, but it further allows for the tissues throughout the limb to be able to take on a role that improves their ability to distribute forces and dissipate forces. Okay, so really, really important to consider that, because if we don't consider those global features and we go locally too soon, then it can create a lot of confusion within therapy. So we want to look at those global association qualities first, but we can go locally then, but always go global first, then local. But it's important to consider these key design features when we're looking at the global features and the global capacities that we want to try and restore during treatment.